Life in our little Michigan town was ordinary, boring even. School, video games, and the occasional grounding from Mom. The house wasn't perfect, but Grandma made it feel like home. And then she was gone.
She left town.
Mom said one night at dinner, barely looking at me. She sat at the head of the table, cutting her steak into small, deliberate pieces. "What do you mean?" I asked.
She's visiting a friend.
Mom replied flatly, shoving a forkful of steak into her mouth.
She'll be back when she's ready.
The way she chewed, slow and mechanical, made my stomach turn. Grandma hated leaving home. Something wasn't right. The first week without Grandma felt strange. Mom started acting weird. One minute, she'd hum cheerfully while scrubbing the counters. The next, she'd slam drawers so hard they'd rattle. She started locking the garage. "Why?" I asked one afternoon.
Raccoons.
She said, her tone clipped. I'd never seen a raccoon near our house, but I didn't argue. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth in the hallway. I cracked my door open just enough to see her shadow. She was standing in front of the garage door, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her hand gripping the doorknob so tightly her knuckles were white. "Mom?" I whispered. Her head snapped towards me, her eyes wide and bloodshot, a grin spreading across her face.
Go back to bed.
She said softly, almost a whisper. Then she turned and shuffled toward her bedroom, dragging her feet like she wasn't entirely awake. I didn't sleep that night. A week later, a thick, putrid smell hung on the air. "Mom, what is that?" I asked, covering my nose with my hoodie sleeve.
Plumbing issue.
She said, her voice hollow.
I'll fix it.
She didn't fix it. The smell got worse, seeping into every corner of the house. Mom didn't seem to notice. She started spending hours in the garage, covered in sweat, her hair plastered to her face. Then, there was the night I found her in the kitchen holding a butcher knife. The light from the fridge cast her face in harsh shadows, making her look gaunt, almost skeletal. Her lips moved silently if she were talking to someone who wasn't there. "Mom?" I said, my voice barely audible. She turned her head slowly, her eyes gleaming in the dim light.
Why are you up?
She asked, her voice low and almost guttural. I was thirsty." She stared at me for a long time, then smiled. Her teeth were yellowed and her lips cracked.
Go to bed,
she said. I didn't argue. The night I opened the garage, I thought I was going to die. Mom had gone out and the smell was unbearable. I grabbed the spare key she thought I didn't know about and unlocked the door. The second it opened, the stench hit me like a wave. My eyes watered as I gagged, pulling my shirt over my nose. The light flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows over the cluttered space. Tools hung on the walls, their edges glinting like teeth. Boxes were stacked in the corners, but my eyes were drawn to the tarp. It was crumpled in the far corner, soaked in something dark that had spread across the concrete floor. My hands shook as I pulled it back. Underneath was Grandma. Her lifeless eyes stared back at me with her wrinkly mouth wide open, her body covered in terrible bruises and limbs crumpled at unusual angles like an old doll. Flies buzzed around her decaying flesh. My stomach churned and I stumbled back, knocking over a box of tools. And then I heard it, the sound of tires on the driveway. I barely had time to cover the body before sprinting upstairs. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grab my phone.
911, what's your emergency?
"Please," I whispered. "You have to come. My mom, she killed my grandma. Her body's in the garage. Please, hurry." I hung up just as I heard the front door creak open.
John!
Mom called out, her voice sing-song. I pressed my back against my bedroom door, trying to stay silent. Her footsteps grew louder and heavier, stopping just outside my room. The doorknob rattled.
John?
She said again, her voice muffled through the door.
What are you doing in there?
My heart felt like it would explode. "Nothing," I stammered. The knob stopped moving, and her footsteps retreated. The sirens came 20 minutes later. Mom's screams were animalistic as the cops dragged her out of the garage. Her hair was wild. Her face was streaked with tears and sweat.
You did this?
She shrieked, her voice cracking.
You called the cops? You turned on your own mother!
Her eyes locked on mine, filled with a hatred that made my blood run cold. How could you kill your own mother? I yelled, my voice shaking. I'd rather have a grandma than a maniac mother. In January 2020, 50-year-old Carol Ray from Roseville, Michigan was charged with first-degree murder, felony firearm, and larceny over $20,000 for allegedly killing her 69-year-old mother, Patricia Bennett. Authorities discovered Bennett's decomposing body in a plastic storage bin in the garage during a welfare check. Ray reportedly used her mother's cell phone to send messages to family members, posing as Bennett to avoid suspicion. She also allegedly accessed her mother's bank accounts during this period. It was another hot, dry day in Elephant Butte, New Mexico. The sun beat down on the cracked pavement as I walked, thinking about how I'd get by tomorrow. Then I saw him, a clean-cut man in a uniform, flashing a badge. "You're under arrest," he declared firmly, calmly. I froze, unable to comprehend anything, until he clamped his grip onto my wrist like a vice. Before I could process what was happening, there was this woman beside him, smirking, and they dragged me into his truck.
Don't fight. It'll make it worse.
The woman said. I could scream for help, but the car was moving too fast. The landscape blurred into an endless desert until we stopped outside a trailer. I'll never forget it. A weathered, unassuming box in the middle of nowhere. My stomach churned as they shoved me through the door. Inside, it came, the stench of blood and sweat and metallic. The moment my gaze was directed to the room, my legs lost their grip. Every surface was covered in instruments of torture, chains, whips, saws, and devices I couldn't even name. The walls were plastered with photos of women, some bound, some screaming, all broken. And in the center was the chair. It wasn't a chair for sitting. It was a throne for experiment. "Welcome, doll. I'm David," the man said, his voice sickeningly polite. "And she's Cindy," pointing to the girl. He smiled, a predator sizing up his prey. "You're gonna make a fine addition to my collection." Before I could scream, Cindy shoved me onto the chair, the leather straps biting into my arms and legs. David turned on a tape recorder, and his voice, detached, emotionless, filled the room. "If you're hearing this, you're mine now." The recording started. "You'll experience pain like you've never imagined. No one will hear your screams. You're here until I decide to throw away my toy." I struggled against the restraints, but they were too tight. David chuckled, picking up a scalpel from the table. He pressed the blade against my skin, tracing a line down my arm, then across my stomach. The cuts were shallow at first, just enough to sting, but as my screams grew louder, his smile widened. "Let's brand you properly, eh?" he said, reaching out to grab a glowing branding iron. I thrashed against the chair, raw and bloody at the wrists, but there was nothing to be done. He pressed the iron against my thigh. The searing pain was indescribable, a white-hot explosion that stole my breath, but his wicked grin widened. "What a beautiful canvas. Love it. I love it. You're my 24th, he said, carving 24 into my flesh with a burning blade. The smell of burning skin filled the air, mixing with my screams. But he wasn't finished.
Time for a makeover.
Cindy sneered,
Should I just pull it off her head, David?
grabbing my hair. She started pulling as I felt my skin tearing almost. I blacked out from the pain, and when I regained consciousness, blood was dripping in from my eyebrows as I saw my scalp burning. Then David took a knife, slashing shallow cuts into my exposed scalp. It was a bloodbath. And he continued with all of these for hours or days. I don't even remember anymore. He pressed his cattle prod across my thigh and stomach. There came jolts of electricity that made my muscles jerk uncontrollably. The clamps he applied would twist and pull on the skin until it would tear. Every scream just fueled his sick delight. He'd often force me to sit there while he tortured others. Women would be wheeled in, pale-faced and crying. He would strap them onto his devices, pushing their bodies into unnatural angles, literally breaking them. Their screams would mix with mine in the room, forming a chorus of agony. But the psychological torture was worse. He stood holding up a mirror, forcing me to look at myself, bloodied, bruised, and broken, almost unrecognizable. "You're nothing now," he whispered. "Just another plaything." I wanted to die. I prayed for it, but part of me refused to give in. I waited, biding my time, hoping for a mistake. Cindy made it. One day, she left the keys to my chains within reach. My hands trembled as I reached for them, the cold metal slippery with sweat. It felt like an eternity before the lock clicked open. I ran. My legs screamed with each step, the wounds opening on my body, and yet I did not even slow. I burst through the trailer into the desert, the sun blinding me. Cindy's calls followed me, and David's angry voice led the air. I reached a nearby house, banging on the door until it opened. The look on the homeowner's face told me everything. They knew something unspeakable had happened to me. The police came, their sirens slicing through the quiet desert night. David and Cindy were arrested, and their reign of terror was finally over. But even as they were taken away, I couldn't shake the horrors I'd endured. I managed to escape, but the toy box will never leave me. In the dark, sometimes I still hear his voice, cold and mocking, and I see the faces of the women who didn't make it out, their silent screams etched into my mind forever. The toy box killer, David Parker Ray, was a sadistic criminal who abducted, tortured, and sexually assaulted women in a soundproof trailer he called his toy box in New Mexico during the 1980s and 90s. Equipped with horrific devices and tools, the trailer was designed for prolonged torture. Ray allegedly killed several victims, though no bodies were definitively linked to him. His crimes came to light in 1999 when a woman escaped and alerted authorities. Ray was convicted of kidnapping and torture, but died of a heart attack in 2002 while serving a 224-year prison sentence. His accomplices faced lesser charges. The winter was colder than any I could remember. Snow blanketed the streets, and the air in our house felt like it carried more than just winter's chill. My sister Karen and I used to sit in the attic late at night, whispering about Mom. Losing her left a hole that never healed, and one night we thought we'd try something different, a seance. We lit candles, whispered her name. Karen swore she heard something, a faint shuffle, like footsteps in the walls. I laughed it off. "It's just rats," I said. We didn't think anything would happen, and at first, nothing did. But then we started hearing the whispers. At first, they were faint, like the wind slipping through the cracks in the house, but they grew louder, persistent. Sometimes they sounded like a voice, low, guttural, as though someone was struggling to form words. Karen and I told Dad, but he just laughed. "It's an old house," he said. "Creaky walls, rats in the pipes, nothing to worry about." But the noises didn't stop. One morning, I woke up to find my room trashed. Clothes were scattered across the floor, my desk drawers pulled out, and their contents dumped. At first, I thought Karen was playing a joke, until she showed me her room, the same chaos. But there was something worse. A message was written on my mirror in what looked like red lipstick. "I see you." Karen found one too. "Do you miss me?" We screamed for Dad, who scowled and accused us of trying to scare each other. But Karen and I knew better. Something or someone was in the house with us. It escalated quickly. One night, I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing so close it felt like someone was standing over me. My body froze, too terrified to move. I finally gathered the courage to flick on the light, but my room was empty. Karen wasn't so lucky. She woke up screaming, claiming she'd seen a pale face peering at her through the crack in her closet door. Dad stormed into her room, but when he opened the closet, there was nothing there. Karen was hysterical, swearing she wasn't imagining things. And then there were the other things. Our food started going missing. Whole loaves of bread, jars of peanut butter, milk cartons. Once, Karen found her favorite sweater, torn and crumpled, stuffed behind the couch. The toilet flushed on its own. Lights flickered. The whispers became words, chilling and deliberate. "Come find me." One evening, I stayed up late, reading in the living room. The house was quiet, and for a moment, I felt safe. Then I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like fingernails dragging along the wall behind me. I whipped around, but nobody was there. My heart pounded as the sound grew louder, moving closer. That's when I saw it, a pair of eyes staring at me through a tiny hole in the wall. I screamed, and Dad came running. He insisted I must have imagined it, but I knew what I saw. Someone was watching us. We tried to ignore it, but the terror only grew. One night, we found all the kitchen knives laid out on the counter, their blades glinting in the moonlight. Another time, Karen discovered a small pile of hair, her hair, tucked into her pillowcase. The worst was when I found a Polaroid photo under my bed. It was a picture of me taken while I was sleeping. Dad finally believed us after that. He searched the house from top to bottom, opening every closet and checking under every piece of furniture. When he reached Karen's wardrobe, he hesitated, his hand trembling as he grasped the handle. When he opened it, we saw him. A boy crouched inside, his face painted ghostly white. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his grin was twisted into something inhuman. He held a rusted wrench in one hand and a hatchet in the other. "Don't scream," he said softly. His voice was calm, almost kind, but it made my blood run cold. He ordered us into Karen's bedroom, locking the door behind us. We could hear him moving through the house, his footsteps unnervingly light for someone carrying weapons. The minutes stretched into hours before Karen and I darted to climb out the window and run to our neighbor's house. The police arrived quickly, but when they searched the house, they found nothing. No boy, no weapon. It was like he'd vanished. 2 nights later, Dad saw him again. He was staring out of Karen's bedroom window, his face pale, illuminated by the moonlight. This time, Dad called the police immediately. When they arrived, they tore the house apart, finally discovering a tiny crawl space hidden behind the bathroom wall. Inside was the boy, Daniel, wearing one of our mom's clothes, which he probably stole in the middle of the night. He'd been living there for weeks, maybe months. The crawl space was filled with food wrappers, empty cans, and small, disturbing items, locks of our hair, trinkets he'd stolen, and dozens of Polaroid photos of us. And then there were the holes, dozens of them, drilled into the walls, just big enough for him to watch us. He'd been there the entire time, watching us sleep, eat, live. But still, sometimes, late at night, when the world is silent, I hear it again. The whispers, "Come find me." The Daniel LaPlante case is a chilling story of a Massachusetts teenager who, in 1986, hid inside the walls of a family's home for weeks. After posing as a friendly suitor to one of the family's daughters, Daniel began tormenting them by making strange noises, moving items, and leaving unsettling messages. The family eventually discovered him living in a crawlspace behind their walls, wearing their late mother's clothes. This terrifying invasion highlighted his disturbing behavior, which escalated to a horrific triple murder of another family later. LaPlante is now serving multiple life sentences in prison.